Martha Gellhorn was present during every single war and conflict around the world for 60 years. She was the only woman to land on the shores of Normandy during D-Day. Throughout the course of her life, she was a pacifist and devoted her life to documenting everything she could with a sense of perspective and empathy for the human beings that she was surrounded by. Many have called her the greatest war correspondent who ever lived. Born in 1908 in St. Louis, Missouri, Martha Gellhorn could not have asked for two more feminist parents in the world. Her mum was a suffragette and her dad was a gynecologist, so they were all about female empowerment. In 1916, her mother brought Martha to witness 7,000 people protesting at the Democratic National Convention for a woman's right to vote when she was only 8 years old. This event, it stuck with her for the rest of her life, and young Martha never took her vote for granted. The Gellhorns raised their daughter to know that she could do anything a man could do, which gave her the confidence that would help her throughout the rest of her life. Martha Gellhorn attended Bryn College, which is a private all-girls school just outside of Philadelphia. She dropped out before she completed her degree in journalism because she realized that it was not necessary for her to start a career in writing. Martha was able to get a few articles published in a publication called The New Republic. Armed with a byline, she applied for a position as a foreign correspondent in Paris and got a job at the United Press. In 1930, she was 22 years old and living a happy and romantic life in Paris. Unfortunately, she became the victim of sexual harassment at work. When she refused to sleep with someone in exchange for a raise, she was fired. She continued to live in Paris and sell her articles to several magazines, including Vogue. But by 1934, she decided it was time to move back to the United States because she felt that the American people needed someone to give them a voice. President Roosevelt had created an organization called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and Martha Gellhorn began working for them. She would interview upwards of 5 underprivileged families every single day and heard about their struggles with poverty, disease, and a whole lot more. Seeing American people live in such horrible conditions during the Great Depression, it was shocking. She wanted to let the world know that the so-called American dream, it wasn't as glamorous as everyone seemed to think it was. Her articles, they were so moving that Eleanor Roosevelt herself read them and reached out in order to become Martha Gellhorn's friend. While working at FIRA, Martha encouraged a group of workers to protest when their boss was treating them unfairly. This escalated into a riot and windows were broken. She was fired and they tried to label her as a communist. However, the Roosevelts were on her side and they helped to make sure that the crooked bosses were removed. After losing her job, Martha Gellhorn was invited to live and work in the White House. She helped Eleanor Roosevelt with writing her monthly column called My Day for a magazine called Woman's Home Companion. However, these topics she was writing with the First Lady were very vapid compared to the hard-hitting journalism that she was used to. Gellhorn thanked the Roosevelts for their kindness, but she wanted to move on with her career. She published a book called The Trouble I've Seen, which described the suffering of the American people in the Great Depression. Deep down, she knew that she wanted to use her writing to help people, and eventually she would get her wish. Even though Martha Gellhorn had already accomplished so much during her early writing career, much of that is overshadowed by the fact that she fell in love with the famous author Ernest Hemingway. In 1936, Martha Gellhorn was in Key West, Florida on vacation with her parents when she decided to get a drink at a bar called Sloppy Joe's. At first, she was taken aback by a loud and dirty man who was telling wild stories and acting like the center of attention. She locked eyes with the man across the room and realized that this was the famous Ernest Hemingway. He approached her and they began to strike up a conversation. Even though he did not recognize her face, it turns out that he had in fact read her articles and indeed her first book. They both had a very similar writing style in the way that they cut out all of the flowery language in favor of getting to the point. They also deeply cared about the struggles of other human beings. By the end of their first conversation, it was clear that they had chemistry and they wanted to see each other again. Hemingway told her that he was headed to the Spanish Civil War to write the script of a documentary called This Spanish Earth. He would eventually narrate the movie as well because the actor they hired couldn't get the cadence exactly right. Martha Gellhorn had never written on the war before, and she secured a contract with Colliers Magazine and followed him there soon after. There were several other men on the documentary crew, as well as other reporters who lived and worked together at the Hotel Florida in Madrid. No one could be sure exactly when their relationship escalated from co-workers to lovers, though. In a lot of ways, they truly were the perfect couple. There was perhaps no other man alive on the planet who was manly enough to handle Martha Gellhorn's strength, and she could keep up with Hemingway's need for adventure. Over the next 4 years, Gellhorn and Hemingway continued their affair while he was still married to his second wife, by the way, Pauline Pfeffer. Alright, so before you go calling Martha Gellhorn nasty names in the comments of this video, you should know a bit about Ernest Hemingway's first two marriages. Hemingway's first wife was named Hadley Richardson. After he became a best-selling author in 1926 with The Sun Also Rises, he started receiving a lot of attention, and suddenly he had to deal with fangirls who fell in love with his masculine writing style. However, he was still very poor and he could hardly pay for his basic needs. A woman called Pauline Pfeffer grew up spoiled by wealthy parents, and she secured a posh gig writing fashion columns for Vogue magazine. She often wrote in the first person about attending lavish parties and fashion shows. Pfeffer was used to getting everything in life that she wanted, and Hemingway was added to that wish list. She swept in, claiming that she wanted to be best friends with Hadley Richardson. The two women had almost nothing in common, and it was truly odd that this wealthy heiress was suddenly so interested in this impoverished couple. Pauline Pfeffer seduced Hemingway and became pregnant with his child. He had to divorce Hadley and he married Pauline, but spent the rest of his career bitterly writing about how much he actually hated her. So no one really felt very sorry for Pfeffer when she ended up being cheated on too. In fact, most feel that Martha Gellhorn was his true love, and it took marrying two of the wrong women before he could find her. Their time in Spain, it was exhilarating. Gellhorn found this new love and compassion for the people who were affected by the war. She and Hemingway both worked in China to cover the events of the Second Sino-Japanese War. From there, she covered the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia and Finland. When they were not working together on assignment, they would write letters to one another and only meet up when their schedules aligned. They had an affair for a total of 3 years, and he only grew more and more convinced that this was the woman that he truly wanted to marry. In 1939, Hemingway purchased a 15-acre estate in Cuba for Martha and he to live on together. After getting his new life settled, he officially divorced his second wife, and he and Martha were married in 1940. Even though they now had this beautiful house together in a tropical paradise, Martha continued to travel the world as a war correspondent. Hemingway continued to write his novels alone at his typewriter and went fishing and drinking with the locals. He was so lonely that he began a very strange hobby of breeding six-toed cats. He bred so many of them that they soon overran his estate. For a few years, Gellhorn and Hemingway, they seemed to be living a very happy life together in Cuba, enjoying the beaches and the sunshine. Unfortunately, it became toxic when Hemingway began to ask Martha if she was ever going to settle down and become more nurturing. This is when things got a bit awkward. Hemingway was used to going on his wild adventures. Then he could come home to housewives like Hadley and Pauline, who were happy to cook, clean, and look after the children. He knew that being a war correspondent was Martha's passion, but he figured that after getting married, she would calm down and become a novelist who did all of the typical duties of a wife and a mother. But her motivation for being on the front lines, it never went away, and she did not want to have any children with him. Hemingway already had several children from his previous marriages, but there came a point when he felt that he was truly missing starting a new family with her. But Martha felt that it was her duty to be a witness to the atrocities of war instead of staying at home where it was safe. If nobody puts it down on the record anywhere, then the monsters win totally. It must be someplace on the record, because otherwise they can get away with anything. Does it stop anything? I don't feel that anything I have been done is any use, but at least it is better than silence, because if you are silent, they can rewrite it any way they want. They can make it look great afterwards. So there is a point in the record. Aside from his hobby of being a crazy cat lady, Hemingway continued his midlife crisis by getting into the habit of hunting for German U-boats off the coast of Cuba. He never actually caught any, but he still filled his boat with grenades because he had the mindset that maybe one day he could be the hero who demolished a Nazi submarine. When the news came that the Allies were about to storm the beaches of Normandy, Martha did not waste any time securing a press pass from Colliers Magazine. She was friends with the British author Roald Dahl, and he helped her to get set up with a sponsorship to have her plane ticket paid for by the Royal Air Force, so long as she wrote positively about them in her piece. For whatever reason, whether it was anger, jealousy, or pure spite, Hemingway marched right into Colliers and demanded to take a press spot. Since he was the famous novelist, they couldn't refuse the opportunity to publish one of his pieces. They gave him Martha's plane ticket and the press pass. Martha was infuriated by his betrayal, but she was still determined to make her way into the war zone. She dressed up as a Navy nurse and stowed away in the bathroom of a ship that was headed to Europe. So while Hemingway was boarding a plane, Martha Gellhorn was struggling to get to Europe by sea. Once he arrived in Paris, Hemingway began partying almost immediately, and he decided to work together with a ragtag group of war correspondents who were on a mission to liberate the Hotel Ritz in Paris. This used to be his favorite bar in the city, and he wanted nothing more than to get into some Nazi fighting action. It was at this point that Hemingway also began cheating on Gellhorn with a woman he met called Mary Welsh. Finally, after stowing away on a ship and risking her life, Martha Gellhorn arrived at the harbour in Liverpool, ready to confront her husband. She heard that he was in the hospital in London because he'd gotten into a car accident while drunk driving. When she found Hemingway, he seemed perfectly fine aside from a gash in his head, which was wrapped in bandages. He was drinking whiskey surrounded by fans who were hanging on his every word. Martha decided not to waste any more time or energy on Hemingway. She went to Normandy and snuck her way into the front lines of D-Day. Since Hemingway still had a press pass, Gellhorn had no choice but to dress as a nurse and help to carry injured soldiers on a stretcher on and off the battlefield. She paid close attention to her surroundings, making mental notes so that she could write them down later. She stayed in Europe and made her way to the Dachau concentration camp. Martha was one of the very first and only journalists to arrive on the scene when it was liberated by the Allies. No one could have ever anticipated the horrors that unfolded there. Martha Gellhorn was mere feet away from the starved bodies of the Jewish prisoners lying next to the dead German soldiers who were perfectly well fed. She describes a horrific scene of bodies with shaved heads that were so thin their ages and genders were indistinguishable from one another. She could smell the rotting of their corpses. The last shipment of prisoners had arrived from Buchenwald to Dachau, but the Nazis locked the train doors from the outside and left them to die slowly of starvation. Gellhorn describes a Polish prisoner they found inside of a train car. One man had survived. He was found in a pile of the dead. Now he stood on the bones that were his legs and talked and suddenly wept. Everyone is dead. On the plane ride out of Germany, Martha sat together with a group of stunned American prisoners of war who had been rescued from Dachau. She wrote, "No one looked out the window as we flew over Germany. No one wanted to see Germany again. They turned away from it in sickness. Everything about it was evil." The men sat in silence for a long time until one soldier said, "No one will believe us." After bearing witness to some of the most sickening atrocities in human history, it only reminded Martha Gellhorn why her job to expose the truth was so important. She knew that she needed to continue to devote her life to this cause. On her flight back home, she must have reflected on how petty all of the arguments with her husband truly were. None of it was worth it anymore. When she was back in the United States, she filed for divorce from Hemingway. He was absolutely furious and wrote letters to her saying that she was a phony and pretentious bitch. Then he set out to ruin her reputation just like he had with his second wife. Their divorce was so uncivilized she scarcely wanted to speak to him or about him ever again. During interviews later in life, Martha Gellhorn refused to talk about her marriage with Hemingway. "I've been a writer for over 40 years. I was a writer before I met him and I was a writer after I left him. Why should I merely be a footnote in his life?" Hemingway would go on to get married to his mistress, Mary Welsh. She would be his fourth and final wife, and she had absolutely no problem fitting into the role of a homemaker. Unfortunately, even though he got the sort of wife he wanted, Hemingway continued to struggle with being happy. He would eventually commit suicide in 1961. Following her divorce from Ernest Hemingway, Martha Gellhorn decided to remain single for several years and focused on her career. In 1949, she visited Rome to see children in an orphanage who had lost limbs or become blind because of accidentally stepping on landmines. She wrote a piece called "The Children Pay the Price" for the Saturday Evening Post. Her heart was breaking for these children, so she chose to adopt a little boy called George Sandy Alexander. Since she was an American woman trying to adopt an Italian boy, she had to write several letters to the Roosevelts asking for their help to bring Sandy back to the United States so that she could provide a better life for him. However, her busy schedule prevented her from being a full-time mother. Most of the time, Sandy was left in the care of Martha's parents, and he was later sent to boarding school. After taking some time to be on her own, Martha began dating several successful men who were doctors, businessmen, and journalists. Eventually, she married the editor of Time magazine, T.S. Matthews, in 1954, but they got a divorce in 1963. After 2 failed marriages, she never tried again. The lifestyle she chose of traveling to far-off places to put her life in danger was very difficult to balance with being a wife or a mother. So she remained single, traveling the world and reporting from the front lines because she truly felt compelled that this was what she was supposed to be doing with her life. When we talk about honoring people in the armed forces, the word sacrifice is often used. For Martha Gellhorn, she truly did sacrifice everything to be a war correspondent. She gave up her marriages, the chance to have children, and precious time spent with friends and family. Instead of living for herself, she chose an existence that gave a voice to the downtrodden all around the globe. Martha often traveled alone with nothing to her name except a single suitcase of her bare essentials. She wrote that loneliness was far more difficult than anything else. In one of her letters, she wrote, I was used to having only myself. Cold and hard as that is, I could live with it. And now I wait for a voice, a face, a body that is not mine, does not, in any case, wait as I do, nor share this homesickness. After witnessing so many wars, there was nothing that Martha Gellhorn hated more than a government who was power-hungry. In her book, The Face of War, she gives a breakdown of just how much money the United States spends on nuclear weapons, and at the time she wrote the book, it amounted to over $1 billion a day. So much could be done with that money to help the poor and the sick, and yet it all goes into these weapons that could lead to the destruction of the human race. For her, the straw that broke the camel's back was witnessing firsthand what Americans were doing during the Vietnam War. It disgusted her so much that she couldn't bring herself to continue living in the United States. She moved to London, which is where she spent the rest of her life. In 1998, she was 89 years old and almost completely blind. She was also suffering from ovarian cancer. She was sick and barely hanging on to life. So she decided to commit suicide by ingesting a cyanide capsule and left everything she had to her adopted son, Sandy. 10 years later, in 1999, the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism was established. In order to win the award, a war correspondent must accomplish reporting that is essentially a human story that penetrates the established version of events and illuminates an urgent issue, the unpalatable truth, validated by powerful facts that exposes establishment conduct and its propaganda. Even after witnessing some of the darkest parts of humanity through the course of her career, she never gave up hope that people can be good. I do not hope for a world at peace, all of it, all the time. I do not believe in the perfectibility of man, which is what would be required for world peace. I only believe in the human race. I believe the human race must continue. For years to come, Martha Gellhorn will continue to inspire war correspondents everywhere to do just that. Get on the ground, find the truth of what people are experiencing, and tell the world. By understanding one another, we can only get closer to remaining in a world where peace exists and wars are few and far between. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this 4 times a week. Also, let me know what you thought of this video. Use the comments, all of that good stuff. And I'll see you next time.